I'm Rick from Carthage Classic Cars. We're back on the 70 Challenger. You could see from watching previous videos that the car looks a lot different right now. We have the whole entire front clip on the car. It's in bare metal. We've sandblasted it, and I'll go through on the video why we did that and the process in that. But right now, where we're at, we got a couple more things to tidy up, and I got to get this car in epoxy before it starts surface rusting. So we're going to weld up the shock towers. We got a couple brackets up here to fine tune. We're going to epoxy prime all of this to match the rest of this car, and then we're going to go through, and by the end of the video, the whole entire front end exterior sheet metal will be bolted on this car. I'll show you how we got to this point and the next step in the process on assembling the front of one of these e-body cars. So stay tuned. We'll go through what we've done, how we got here, and we'll come back, we'll get it sealed up. Is this car a little excessive sandblasting brand new parts and getting everything prepped out with spot welds and everything? Yes. But I think the idea of doing the overkill stuff right now, because we can't get in certain areas, you know, in between panels like the cowl panel down the road. So if we overkill it now, the car should last, I mean, if it's taken really good care of, forever. So that's the idea behind the video. Stay tuned. Let's get to building some of this car, and we'll go over how we got to this level.
So the start of this process, and pretty much every one of our build processes, we test fit the whole entire car. I screw everything together, I line it up. I don't show that on camera because, you know, usually that takes the longest amount of time and we run into the most issues. So the second time you're watching these videos, just in full disclosure, is usually the second or third time the car is going together. Of course, when you put it together 2 or 3 times, they usually assemble at that point a lot easier, where the first time you'd watch me fight and pull in, scratching my head a little bit trying to figure things out. But while it's together the first time, I go ahead and I'm making marks on all of these new parts. This is where we're going to drill our holes where our spot welder will not reach, and then we're going to go back through and MIG weld them. So the second time we put everything together, we're going to just start assembling again, and then we can just go ahead and we know where all our MIG welds got to go, and it streamlines the whole process just in general. So if you've seen other previous build videos on this 70 Challenger, this is going to be a little different. What we're in right now, we're inside my sandblast cabinet. We're behind a couple of sheets of plexiglass. That's why it's a little bit fuzzy, but you can see I'm taking all these small parts along with everything else we had from the car that's original, and we're going to go through and just sandblast everything right here. It's going to be the most efficient on the small parts versus taking the belt sander out and getting inside everything. Obviously, we're in time lapse and we're sped up. This took a lot longer than it really was, but realistically the sandblaster goes pretty smooth. I do have to say I run a air compressor with 26 CFM as far as my airflow rate, and I also have an air chiller to use as a dryer. So if you're sandblasting this much at home, be aware the thing that really slows this process down and clogs up the sandblaster is going to be moisture. So do your best, try to keep all the moisture out of lines, and when the compressor is running constantly, all that heat being pumped in the tank is where that moisture is coming from. So just a little something to be aware of if you start using a sandblaster and you're having issues. As you can see, I have this thing pretty dialed in really well, and on these cars that the owners go full force on and give me the go ahead and strip everything down, the process becomes real easy, and this is the most efficient, like I said, versus using sandpaper, hand sand and stuff in there. Obviously we're not going to take the big parts, and that's where the strip and drum works a little bit better. The only problem about the sandblaster, it's a suction feed sandblaster. So it does take a little bit longer to sandblast stuff versus what you'll see in the future, a pot pressure blaster. We're back to the areas now, the parts that we're going to use on the pot pressure blaster, and we're going to dry blast everything today. I know in the past on this Challenger you've seen we did wet blast. I have a big industrial wet blaster, but for this small stuff the pot blaster works really good, and you'll see that in a minute. Same thing on here. All these parts were test fitted, and we're going to go through and we're going to run our holes. Now right here you're going to see I can get my spot welder in, but I am drilling holes on top of this because the frame rails and the shock towers, I think they're real thick metal, and I don't really trust my spot welder enough to just alone hold it. So we're going to hit it with both the MIG welders and the spot welders, which you see in the future. Here we are, we're on to the pop blasting. So this is not going to be as efficient as a sands, which when I say sand, same thing on the blast cabinet, it's actually medium grit recycled glass. It's not actual beach sand. But you could see I'm sitting there and using it. I'm pressurized at 100 PSI. I got a Ameriblast kit on a Northern Tool 100-pound pop blaster. And you could see it makes really efficient work of just taking the E-coat off these parts. When I have a car that has to strip, rusted old 50-year-old metal and everything else, it does take a lot longer. But with this E-coat, it really does strip all this stuff pretty efficiently. And now this is going to be, like I said, on these parts, especially the radiator support, trying to get like a DA sander in there, a belt sander, disc sander, everything else, it can be done. It just takes a lot longer. I'm not putting a ton of pressure and a ton of sand on this, and you see I'm back pretty far, and I'm kind of hitting everything at an angle. Mostly what we're trying to do here and to accomplish is that just dust off most of the E-coat. If there's some just left behind a little bit, we're not too worried about that. The reason we're going to do this is I don't trust the E-coat. It comes off sometimes. I've seen the E-coat with some rust behind it, and I haven't applied it. So the only base material we can trust on these cars when we're putting top coat upon top coat on would be the bare metal. So right now, this is what we're doing. We're going to get down to the bare metal, and then we're going to seal everything in epoxy primer. You'll see in the future. Now that we got everything down in bare metal, I'm going to go ahead and apply some weld through primer. This is going to be the areas that just are going to be sandwiched between two panels. This is going to protect the seams from rusting, and we can't use epoxy here because obviously the epoxy would stop any kind of welding process. And epoxy, when it gets hot, it will start like crimpling up and everything else. Where this weld through primer, I can weld right on top of it, and it discolors a little bit, but the weld through primer holds still on the area that you apply to. So I'm a really firm believer in the weld through primer. It makes welding a little bit harder, but nothing compared to like a spray paint or epoxy paint especially. If you saw the previous video on this Challenger, you saw where we installed this whole brand new firewall and upper cowl panel. I epoxied the whole firewall and cowl panel and sealed everything up. If I was really high speed and test fitted the whole front end here, I could have put some tape on it, put the weld through primer beforehand, but realistically, I just wanted to get that in, epoxy before everything started rusting there. So I take this car in steps. So what I decided to do, you saw, is just sand it down. Here we are, we're doing the final fitment before welding. I did the shock tower brace on this side of the car. Everything is pre-measured and aligned. I matched it off the other side. You've seen in other videos where I've done these shock towers, and I leave them till the very end and we install the whole front suspension. If not, go back and watch camber and caster settings on a 73 Challenger. That video will show you. With this car, I can't really do that because we're at the mercy of the passenger side shock tower being in a factory location. So realistically, the only thing I can do is match the driver's side shock tower. You'll see that in the future. Right now, we're just kind of putting the shock tower in there. We're getting all our inner structure, our inner fenders and our radiator support in the engine bay together and squared up to hold everything right now. And then we're going to come back through in a little bit, and then we're going to fine tune the shock tower. The shock tower measurement, I feel, is the most important because you're going to have your camber caster settings on it. And like I said, if you watch previous videos of mine, you'll see how much that can change with some small adjustments. Realistically, as long as the fenders fit on the car with the inner structure here, the engine bay area, you're good to go. And I already know where everything is because everything's marked with screw holes. I had them clamped first, and I took my measurements on my front end and I assembled the whole front end external sheet metal already. So realistically, right now, I know on the final assembly, everything should fit. Saying that, right before I do weld this up, I don't show it on camera, but I am going to put the fenders on one more time. I don't have to tighten everything down, and we're going to do a quick alignment on the doors to make sure they eye up okay. But I need to make sure everything's good before we go ahead and weld everything up. Also, one thing right there, I'm installing that top bracket for the hinge. I did actually install it on the wrong side of the inner fender. I was just in autopilot mode. However, once I stood back after filming, I went back through and corrected it. This is another good reason why you don't just go welding parts right away. You kind of, what I like to do, I like to screw everything together on the whole entire car, take a step back, look at it, make sure nothing stands out of place, make sure everything else looks right. I'm also very fortunate enough here that I have a couple e-body cars in the garage and around all the time. This is that top bracket I was talking about. This is the right side to install it where it's on the outside. You can see I went back and did it right after the filming and corrected this side. But I can go back through the e-body cars and I could reference off other ones and see where there are. If it's a new car I haven't done before or I don't have a lot in the shop, pictures, pictures, pictures. As you're disassembling this car, take tons and tons of pictures of this car. Go back through and just look at it. And if you have any questions, just reference your picture. They're going to help you out so much. Measurements too. Take as many of these measurements as you can. As you're screwing it back in, you can at least get it where the car was, and then you can fine tune from there. That makes the process a whole lot easier. It's the same thing with these side brackets. You see, I'm putting them on right now, but then in a clip in the future, you'll see those brackets are off and then we reinstall them for the final time. Same concept here. We're going to go ahead and install the final thing before I test fit the fenders will be the lower radiator support area. This just clips right on and it fits on the frame rails. Everything on the frame rails was jigged off my K-member jig and everything else. So it kind of makes life a little bit easier knowing that we can just kind of bolt parts on, knowing they haven't moved and they're in the right location. I wouldn't recommend at all, but if you are building one of these cars not on a frame jig or everything, this is the area I think is the most crucial. You got to make sure your frame rails are level across, they're squared up, because having that base squared off makes the top area, everything else squared off, and it makes the fenders and hood and everything go together. That's why I stress these frame jigs so much, and I think they're just make this whole job so much easier just mounting it to the jig up in the first place. Also about the jig, you see I have those adjustments on the heights on them. Right now my jig is level all the way around. Anytime I'm building on one of these cars, I go out there and I square and level my jig. Now we're going to take the tram, and Megan's reading me off. I have a measurement sheet of all these measurements, like I said, that we've done these cars. I have a nice printout. So we're sitting there and we're just double checking our measurements before we put our fenders on. If these measurements all look good and everything's square, left and right, back and forth, and in the center, everything should be close. Then when I put my external sheet metal on, I just move it a little bit, a 1/4 inch here, 1/8 of an inch here, just to fine tune my fenders. Now we're going to fast forward to the welding portion of this whole install. I will say I did skip the step. You're going to have to trust me on it, where we put the fenders on and the hood on and kind of just did that quick alignment on it. I'm going to show that in the future part of the video when the final time when we put it on. So you can see right now I'm going down to everything with my spot welder. Now the areas on the firewall to the inner fender on those brackets, that's a thinner gauge metal, and I know 100% I've had to remove those spot welds. They are strong, they're not coming off. The shock tower brace to inner fender, my spot welder is giving good penetration. I'm following all the factory settings. I just personally, I've said it in the past on a lot of these other car builds we do, and this one included, I like to do stuff stronger and better than the factory. So in between those spot welds, if I add a MIG weld hole and I just grind it down flush and smooth and you can't see it, all you see is the spot welds, and theoretically I should have probably 4 times more welds, 3 times at least more than the factory ever did in this frame rail and shock tower. But then all you're going to see is the spot welds. So that's the idea on building the car, where I think we're getting the best of both worlds. It still looks somewhat factory, but we're actually making the car a lot stronger and a lot better build quality than the factory would. Moving on to the weld up of the driver's side, I want to point this out again. Currently, the upper control arms shock tower bracket is not welded anywhere on the frame rail. You could see it, it's just loose. What I'm going to do, I'm going to run down the back, weld everything here. The other side, of course, was welded, so I just kind of went through, welded everything else. But I'm going to weld this shock tower brace to the inner fender. We're going to follow the same steps that we did on the other side, go right around with the spot welder, come back through with the MIG welder, and then once we're done with everything, we're happy with our squared off front end, we're going to come back through in a little bit, and I'm going to show you how we match the other side. This is another key piece. I think the takeaway here is building these cars on a frame jig, because we're using angles. We're using a digital angle finder, and we're trying to get everything really close, and the only way to do that is have a level floor. My garage floor is not level. Most garage floors are not level. So like I said, the adjustable frame jig is the way to go. As where you see we're working right around, we're going to go ahead and we're going to remove the screws. And now this is an area on the firewall to these brackets where my spot welder can't reach to both sides. So we're going to just take out the MIG welder, and we're going to run right down the MIG welder in all the holes that we created earlier. This does take a little bit longer. There's nothing wrong with MIG welding these whole entire cars. Honestly, I have the spot welder because a lot of people do like the spot weld look because it's factory style, but it's also saves a whole lot of time and materials in the long run. You know, I'm not going through MIG gas, wire. I mean, especially with the TIG welder, everything else. Obviously, the spot welder has its expendables too, but you don't have to go through and grind everything. It does save a lot of time. So really, the idea behind these cars, we're trying to be the most efficient with our time, and that's going to give the customer the best product while saving the most money. So all in all, that's the idea. You know, we want to build the best quality in an efficient manner without cutting corners. This is what I was talking about earlier. We're going to come back through, a little excessive here, but now we got our spot welders. I'm purposely MIG welding between all the spot welds. The key here, what I'm going to try to make sure I do when I'm taking my grinder and my belt sander, we're not going to run or go anywhere near the spot welds to make sure they still show through. We don't want to have grind marks in them, because then obviously that's going to draw your eye to that part of it, and you start asking more and more questions. We just want the whole front end of this car to just look natural and blend in. We don't want to make it too perfect, and we don't want to make it, you know, too custom. That's the idea here. Now that we're done with the welding process on both the inner fenders, I went and swapped out the head on the spot welder. This arm is going to allow me to reach inside the upper radiator support to the lower radiator support and then weld them together right down the seam. So right now I'm just removing the clamps. Again, everything was pre-positioned, test fit. We're happy with everything, and we're just going to weld the same exact spots that the factory would. I add 2 or 3 welds on each of these brackets, but besides that, I'm trying not to reinvent the wheel here. If the factory had a weld there, it's a good spot to weld. I will say I'm a little spoiled on these cars that, you know, we get to pull the whole entire front clip off the car, because when we can build them in a similar process the factory does, we don't have to try and reinvent the wheel. You know, if there was other parts on this car, these spot welders can't reach in certain areas. So it's actually a little more beneficial to, in the long run, and efficient when we cut half the car apart and can build it brand new pieces one at a time, especially if you're going to take that versus making little patches on this whole entire car. You see how much faster the whole car comes together with only a few pieces. We did the whole engine bay in a pretty quick amount of time. And then, like I said, same process as earlier. Once we get done with the spot welder, I'm coming back through and I'm MIGging up the areas the spot weld welder can't reach, and then the areas that I put my set screws in there, my self-tapping screws. So once those are all welded up, we could come back through with the belt sander and we'll go ahead and start the process on cleaning all the welds up. I try to do all the welding one time. I have all those tools out, and then I'll come back through like right here with the belt sander, and then we're going to just do all the grinding on everything we welded on the whole entire front end. I could stay on the inner structure first and kind of just work my way around it so I'm not climbing in and out. And you see right now, just carefully grinding this down not to gouge into the metal that much. I'm using an 80 grit right now. If you really want to be a little bit finer about it, a 120 would probably even work better. Again, we're trying to be efficient here, and we know we're going to put epoxy on it. This whole engine bay will have 2K on it, so a couple 80 grit scratches I'm not too worried about, but we could also come back through with the 120 grit on top and blend it. This is where I told you it could be real time consuming if you have to grind down all these MIG holes. And you see I put a lot of them in there. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think the cars are just as strong. I built these cars for many years without having a spot welder. And really, the only reason I got the spot welder was just for convenience itself and saving on sandpaper. Saying that, this is what we're going to do with the shock tower. You could see I got the monkey on the stick going from the frame rail to the shock tower. I took an angle finder measurement, a digital angle gauge. I went off my passenger side shock tower in this same upper control arm location mounting point, and I checked in a few spots. And then I brought my digital angle finder, I'm showing you right now, so it's at 0.1 degree negative, basically caster, and then on the other side it matched exactly the same. And then what I did with the monkey on the stick, pulling it in, matching the two measurements, I'm going to go ahead and tack all the corners. Then once all the corners are done tacked, and I think this thing's not going to move, we'll go ahead and release the tension on the monkey on the stick, and then we're going to double check all our measurements. Why I like to do it right now is, now that the inner fender's in, we're not messing up our fender brackets or any exterior structure on top. To me, it's easier to pull this whole bracket in once it's welded and it's sitting naturally. You're welding it together while it's natural and then pulling it. Versus if this was at an odd angle, you're going to fight that whole inner fender to shock tower brace because they don't want to sit together. And then you're going to pull the upper fender area out of alignment. So like I said, I found this to be the best process that worked for me. We're going to go ahead and install the 4-speed Z-bar bracket right there. And I did go ahead and weld in the shock tower brace. I followed the factory steps as far as how it was welded. As much as I want to weld the whole thing through, again, I think it's going to stand out, especially when you see the other side and see it's not welded. So I matched what the factory did with the MIG welder, and it's one of those things, you're trying to make it look factory, but really, if you've seen the factory welds on these cars, they're horrible. So there's only so much I'm going to do. We're not going to go out of our way to make an overly burnt, just crappy weld just because the factory did it. So I think that's something else I try to stick with. What I'm doing right now, you can see, remember we had these side support brackets on and I pulled them off. We now put the pieces going on to the upper cowl, and then we're extending them out. This side's going to be a little different than the driver's side because the driver's side has the upper bracket attached to it. So this one I get to assemble like we would with nothing else there. This bracket had a bunch of weld on it and it was destroyed. So now that we got the bracket tacked in to the upper cowl panel, I can go ahead and take my spot welder, weld under it just like the factory would, and then again it's going to look like the factory spot welds on top of the car. And then we'll come back through once we're done with this spot welder and it's secure, and then we'll put our external upper brace bracket on it. I have the screws pre-aligning everything so I know where it is. We're going to clamp it in place, and I put the MIG holes through the bottom, and we're going to weld right up into that bracket, and we're going to weld, same thing. We have the larger MIG holes going into the shock tower brace. Something else I want to point out that I think is very important, especially working with sandblasted metal, is you don't want to be getting your oil from your hands on the porous surface where sandblasting opens up all these pores in the metal. That's why a sandblasted piece will rust a lot more faster before like a DA sanded piece. So you can see right now, anytime I'm going to be handling the sandblasted metal, I'm using the gloves. There was a time back there where I was sanding down with the belt sander. I took the gloves off, but I made sure and I was aware that I was not touching anything. Realistically, best practice is anytime you have bare metal, you should be using gloves. But realistically, if I'm DA sanding something or belt sanding, there's a lot of times I won't wear the gloves. I have a hard time working with gloves. I love my bare hands. I'm getting over that. It's been a process, slowly working on it. But especially, like I said, with the sandblaster, we don't want my oils absorbed into the metal, and then we're sealing epoxy over it as fast as this sandblast metal can rust. I've seen it, less than 24 hours. Especially, you'll see a car that you'll go out there, and I don't really have greasy hands, but you'll go out to a car 2 days later that, you've touched that's been bare metal. You're going to come back through and, scuff up the whole car and clean up. But the only areas that's rusting are where your fingerprints were, where you're handling that corner piece. So I think this is a best practice. If you get into this, especially if you're sandblasting, try to put in some gloves, try to not touch the bare metal. I'm trying to get better on that too. It's just things we evolve over time, and just we learn from our, just building these cars better. What we're going to do now, just in case we did touch anything or we got anything else on this car, is we're going to go through and hit this whole area that we're going to prime with a wax and grease remover. You could see on the rack are the other parts that we had in the sandblaster, the original parts that we're able to save on the car. With the wax and grease remover, I didn't do anything else to the sandblasted area. I did DA sand some of the areas that we welded and the areas that had weld through primer on. A lot of times epoxy, if you get that weld slag, that black soot around it, you have to get it off because epoxy won't stick very well to that. So those are the only parts I had to prep. Besides that, everything else is ready right from sandblasting for this epoxy primer. The epoxy primer we're going to use in the Omni MP170. It's a gray epoxy. It's a 2-part epoxy, 1-part catalyst, and I add half a part of acetone in it. So basically, we're using this as a sealer, as an epoxy, so we want a thinner coat. We're going to put 2 coats on it, but we don't need to lay this on really thick. This is just basically to seal up the car, because in the future, whoever's going to do the body work and paint on this car, before they put 2K or anything down there, they're still going to have to scuff up all this epoxy, and more than likely, they're going to lay their own epoxy-based material down. If I was doing it, that's what I would personally do. So this epoxy right now is to save the car, protect it from rusting in the future, and really especially seal up the areas that we'll not be able to get to in the future. So that's the idea behind it. And you see, I take each one of these cars with epoxy as a section. We did the middle of the car, we did the floor pan, we did underneath, and then now we're doing the whole entire front end. I'm not worried about epoxying the external sheet metal, and I'll tell you why. We're going to take those parts off after we're done gapping the car, and then we're going to epoxy them inside, outside the car. We'll probably do a lot of them off of the car too, if we can. Obviously the quarter panels we can't, but the fenders and everything, we'll pull them out, and those will be hanging on racks, and they'll be epoxied second. Now right now, these areas, these are the parts that it was easier to sand down, strip out off the car. Now that they're assembled, it would be a pain in the butt to strip everything down. So that's the process and why it's done this way. Fast forward 24 hours. I really give that time because epoxy needs that to cure all the way. You can touch it real quick and poke it and you're not going to hurt it. However, the epoxy is still soft as it's flashing out over those 24 hours. And realistically, if you hold a panel too long, you'll actually leave your fingerprint. So we give it 24 hours. And then what I also try not to do with the epoxy, I try to wait 3 days before we actually sand anything down, because that's the part where you could still add more epoxy or materials on top, and I just think it's still flashing out and has that chemical bond. It's extra gooey. So right now with these cars, I try to pre-plan that there should be no reason anything we epoxied we have to sand or mess with at this point. The whole front end of this car is done. You can see right now we're just bolting on the fenders. I'm throwing them on. What I do, I like to get on these e-body cars, there's a in the back of the fender, there's a little stud coming up. I set that on there and I kind of just roll the front headlight area in, pivot off of it. And I usually like to get that bolt aligned first because that's going to set my door alignment, and then I work on the front. The hood is also centered. I did a laser alignment on it, so it's pretty close to center just to verify everything's straight there. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to measure off my doors, and then my fenders are going to kind of match the hood coming down the center. Of course, there's going to be some fine-tune adjustments you're going to have to make. This is just putting everything on, and then again, you're going to go back and you're going to stand back and look at the car and start adjusting the gaps here or there. We're going to go ahead and install the front hood latch assembly, which also holds the valance into the lower radiator support, this bracket right here. This was another part that was original to the car that we sandblasted, and we're able to save it. It came out really good. And then we're going to go ahead and assemble the lower valance. I went through and I hammer and dollied everything on the lower valance. When we sandblasted it, a bunch of filler came off and we had a bunch of damage. However, saying that, with the hammer and dolly work and everything else, this lower valance is going to be able to be saved. And at this point, like I said, I want to save as much of the original car as we can. We can't save parts with rusted holes in it. It's not worth that. But a part that's got some dents in it, oh yeah, we could just work those out and fix those. And then it keeps the original character of this 1970 Challenger RT. So it was really cool to at least be able to save that. I know the original grill's going in the car. There are a lot of original parts for this car. Just, you know, a lot of the body was just so far gone. It sucks, but it's part of the game. When we rebuild this car, you see it's coming back together as a brand new 1970 Challenger. So let's wrap up the video and have some closing thoughts.
We're going to go ahead and wrap up this video on the 70 Challenger. You could see walking around the whole car, an external sheet metal. Once I installed the fenders, the hood, and the front valance, I went back through and I just realigned everything and just fine-tuned it to the best of my ability without cutting or modifying anything. What we don't want to do right now is we don't want to go ahead and perfectly panel gap all these parts and then install the quarters and come to find out we got to readjust something. So we're just within the constraints of the panels we got, and everything I installed in this video is AMD. I will throw it out there. All the parts from AMD on this Challenger that we installed required no major modification, no drilling of holes, and no cutting or just moving anything around. And realistically, from their door panels to their hood to their fenders, everything fits really well, as you could see. There still is a little bit of work that needs to be done on them, but that's expected on these cars. Looking at the inner structure, I sealed everything off in epoxy primer. You could see we ground down all the areas that we MIG welded, while we also left the areas that were spot welded. That's going to but that's going to make the people that aren't, you know, perfect or know these cars inside and out, they're going to think that the whole front end of this car hasn't been messed with. You saw on the first video why we removed all this stuff and the issues we have in the car. Looking at this car, it might seem excessive to you, and I've said it in other videos that this could be excessive. However, I build cars that aren't mine, and cars that we build are built on YouTube, not for YouTube, if that makes sense. So, you know, there's other channels out there, nothing against them, but that's their car, and they can build it how they want it, and it's built for views. Where now we make money as a shop building these cars for other people, and we try to dial them in, and they're built to go to shows and be scrutinized and judged. So that's why we try to build the highest of quality cars, and then a project like this 70 Challenger, I get is just, you get the right owners and the right cars, it really makes for some, I feel, good YouTube content. We do a lot of other builds in the shop that we don't put on the channel. Filming is obviously really hard, and it kind of, you got to work around the camera. It's something a little different. So there's certain projects on this channel we pick and choose that, like this 70, like I said, was a perfect thing for this channel. Where other cars on the thing, the owners might be great and good people and perfect owners to build with, but then the cars just aren't exciting enough, or they're not as damaged as this one was in the beginning. So that's kind of a little bit more about this car, and where, you know, this channel might be different than others, and where you might look at it, and I say it sometimes, it might be excessive, but I feel it's done the right way. So much so that even behind me, you could see my Firebird, I build that same way. A lot of people have been asking about the Firebird and the CUDA on the part 3 of the bodywork video. I will put an update out. You can see in the back corner, the CUDA's still sitting there, and the Firebird, I will get back to it. We have a couple changes going on in the shop for the better, and the YouTube channel. So we'll update you on a lot of that stuff, but right now we're focused mostly on the customers' cars and building them. So where we're at, you saw, to summarize, we got the whole front end on the car. Where we're doing with this car next, and the next step, we're gonna get it flipped around now that the front's done, and we're gonna start doing the dreaded inner structure. It's kind of elephant in the room. This was the worst part about the car. The owners were not expecting it. It's not a big deal. We'll get it fixed. I've done other builds on these Challengers that look just like this. So we're gonna get that area done. We're gonna get the wheel houses in there, and eventually we'll start doing the rear structure of the car. Really, compared to where this car started only a couple months ago, it's pretty much a real solid, even further along car at this point, and really doesn't need that much more work to be completed. So stay tuned for the next video on this Challenger. Like I said, we're gonna put out other updates on other parts of the cars. Check us out on Facebook too. I have a Facebook page where we put some of the other cars that we're building and the projects that we're doing that I don't take the time and do the YouTube videos. So you could see this on Facebook, and then you could see the other cars on there too if you follow us along on that. If not, and you just want to stick to the YouTube videos, please like, comment, share the videos, and ring the bell to know when we put out new videos. I really appreciate it. It helps us get motivated to put out better content and better builds, and it really gets the word out for the shop, so we can get awesome, cool cars like this in the shop that are kind of taken out of junkyards in the worst condition to build from the ground up. So I'm Rick from Carthage Classic Cars. Thank you very much for following along on this build, the other builds, and we'll see you on the next video.